Hey there, ready for another deep dive? This time, we're jumping into the Great Schism, back in 1054 AD when the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches split. We've got a stack of articles here, and we're going to really dig into why it happened. And get this, the Pope's role is a huge part of it.
Oh, absolutely. It's impossible to separate the schism from the different ways these churches understand authority.
Okay, so we've all heard the phrase vicar of Christ, right? The Catholic Church puts a lot of weight on getting the papacy right. They see it as the keystone that holds everything else together. But is it really that simple?
Well, the articles point out a really interesting difference in how the two sides view this whole issue. The Eastern Orthodox Church, they see things from a completely different angle.
So walk me through this. How does the Orthodox Church view things differently?
For them, it's not about structure first, it's about the core of the faith. They'd argue the schism wasn't about, who gets to be the boss. It was about disagreeing fundamentally on some really core beliefs. Like building a house, you got to get the foundation right. So they focused on the theology and the church structure.
Yeah.
That was secondary.
So it's not about who sits on the papal throne, but about whether what they believe lines up with the East's understanding of Christianity.
Exactly. And this difference in perspective is so key to understanding why things unfolded the way they did. A great example of this is the debate over the filioque.
The filioque. Okay, full disclosure, I did a little side research on that one.
It's a mouthful, for
Right.
sure. Basically, it boils down to whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, or just the Father. Sounds like a small detail, right?
Right.
But that tiny difference actually reflects two totally different understandings of the Trinity. Imagine trying to explain the core of your being, of existence itself, and someone adds a word that changes the whole dynamic.
Wow. Yeah, that puts it into perspective. It's not just a word. It's a whole different way of understanding God. So how does this tie back to the East's view of the papacy?
The articles argue that for the Orthodox Church, adding the filioque to the Nicene Creed, that was such a huge change in theology that it actually impacted their view of the papacy because of that, not the other way around.
Hold on. So they're saying we didn't fall out with the Pope. We fell out with the theology, and then our view of the Pope changed.
You got it. And it gets even more interesting when you start looking at some of the big names from early church history.
Like who?
Well, the article brings up St. Augustine, a giant in both the Eastern and Western churches. And get this, he apparently rejected the idea of Rome having authority over his North African church.
Wait, St. Augustine. St. Augustine. That seems like a pretty big deal. He's not exactly some fringe figure. How do you square that with the Catholic view of papal supremacy?
That's where things get really interesting. The article points out that if being in communion with the Pope was absolutely essential for salvation, as later Catholic doctrine stresses, someone like St. Augustine, holding different views, would be considered, well, a heretic.
But he's still considered a saint by both churches even.
Exactly. Which makes you wonder, right? Does that mean early church practices were really that different from later claims about papal authority? It's a real head scratcher.
Definitely throws a wrench into the idea that everyone was always on the same page about the Pope.
Precisely. And it's not just isolated figures like St. Augustine. If you look at how the early church actually functioned, it gets even more complicated.
Okay, so we've got St. Augustine questioning things, and now you're saying the early church's organization doesn't really support the idea of absolute papal authority. What did they do or not do that backs that up?
Well, let's look at how Rome interacted with churches in the East. The article points out that if papal supremacy was this core belief from the beginning, you'd think they would have been a lot more hands-on.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you believe you're in charge, you usually act like it.
Right. But here's the thing. There's really no historical evidence of Rome appointing bishops in the East.
At all.
Even during major theological crises, like the whole iconoclasm debate, that massive controversy over whether icons were okay or blasphemous.
Right.
Rome didn't step in and start appointing bishops who supported their view.
So they just sat on the sidelines during this huge theological throwdown. Doesn't really scream, we're in charge here, does it?
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, did Rome choose not to use that authority, or did they just not have it to use? And, based on the article, it seems like it might be the latter.
Whoa, okay. That completely changes things, doesn't it? If the papacy, as we understand it, wasn't a thing in the early church, then what? How does that change how we see the Great Schism?
Well, it's like we're looking at a completely different picture now. If the role of the Pope wasn't already set in stone, then the schism becomes less about one side being right and the other wrong. It's more about two different ways of understanding Christianity that just keep drifting further apart.
It's less of a clean break then, and more of a slow drift, like
Oh.
tectonic plates shifting over time.
Perfect analogy. And to add to that, the article brings up this fascinating detail about papal authority.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
How a new pope is elected.
Okay.
So Catholic apologists often argue that the pope has this unique authority passed down directly from Peter,
Right.
and it can't be transferred to another city or leader, like the Patriarch of Constantinople, for example.
Which makes sense. I mean, if you believe it comes from Peter, then it stays where Peter would.
Exactly. But, and this is the interesting part, when a new pope is elected, that authority is transferred, if even temporarily.
Wait, what? How does that work? Do they, like, beam it over to the new guy?
Not quite. It happens through a vote by a council of bishops.
Hold on. They vote. That seems, I don't know, kind of normal, like a very human way to decide something. But doesn't that kind of contradict this idea of an unbroken line of power from Peter?
You got it. If the authority is, inherently tied to the office, why even have an election?
Right.
This voting process, it suggests, at least according to the article, a much more collaborative leadership style in the early church. Sure, the Bishop of Rome was important, but not seen as having this unquestionable power.
Very different from that image we often get of the Pope as this singular, all-powerful figure calling all the shots. So if even some within the Western Church had different views on papal authority, how did the Catholic Church end up where they are now?
Yeah, it's a good question. And while the article doesn't get into the specifics of how that shift happened, it emphasizes that the papacy we see today, it's the product of centuries of history, politics, theological debate. It's not this static, unchanging thing that's been around since Peter.
Right, right. Which makes sense if you think about it, how any large institution changes over time.
Absolutely. Things change, power shifts, interpretations change. This whole deep dive, it's really encouraging us to look beyond the simple explanations and wrestle with the complexities of all of this.
It's a good reminder that history is more than a list of dates and names in a textbook.
Yeah.
It's the story of how we got to where we are, with all its messy bits.
Mm-hmm.
So if the papacy wasn't this all-powerful, unchanging thing from the get-go, that has to change how we see these arguments, right?
Absolutely. And the article brings up what it calls a major flaw in that papacy first argument. It basically says this line of thinking, it can become circular.
Circular, like a theological merry-go-round. You get on in the same place you get off.
Pretty much. Like, they use Catholic theology to justify the structure of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
And then they use the structure of the Catholic Church to justify Catholic theology. It's a closed loop.
So it becomes a we're right because we say we're right kind of thing.
Exactly. And the article argues that this, it can really shut down any meaningful discussion. Instead of encouraging, real dialogue and exploring different viewpoints, it makes questioning the papacy seem like you're questioning the whole of Christianity.
Which, yeah, if you're not Catholic, that's a pretty big barrier right there.
Exactly. And it can lead to these inconsistencies, especially when you're trying to reconcile those later ideas of papal authority with what someone like St. Augustine was actually saying and doing back in the day.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. It just doesn't quite work.
Right. And this brings us to, I think, a really crucial point the article raises. We have to approach this whole debate with a lot of humility and with open minds. It's not about one side winning or losing. It's about really trying to understand this huge, complex tapestry of Christian history.
It's about understanding that there are multiple perspectives on this,
Mm-hmm.
and that's part of what makes it so interesting.
Absolutely. And, if this deep dive has shown us anything, it's that the Great Schism wasn't just this sudden break. It was the result of centuries of debate, changing politics, evolving ideas about authority.
It was a slow burn.
Exactly.
It reminds us that history isn't just about names and dates in a textbook, right? It's a story. And like any good story, it's messy, it's complicated, it's full of surprises. So next time someone tries to tell you the Great Schism was just some power grab, or about just one single belief, remember this conversation. It was so much bigger than that. And understanding those complexities, it can help us understand Christianity today. What do you think? Did this deep dive make you rethink what you thought you knew about the Great Schism? Let us know.